Well, first of all, thank you very much, Matt, for that introduction. Thanks to Mike and the Chief for inviting me. It's a great organisation to work with. You all know that, and I'm really privileged to have the opportunity to work with Mike and Matt and all the colleagues at Achieve again. I also think, by the way, just in passing, that the ADP project is one of the most important grounds for hope in school reform in this country, and I want to congratulate you all on the work you've been doing state by state and nationally. I think it's really, really important work. Some of you were probably at a session I did with Katie Haycock and the Education Trust on deliverology back in July, and if you were there, you will have heard a lot of what I'm going to talk about again. So if you want to leave and get a coffee, this is your chance. Otherwise, you can compare the performances, a bit of global benchmarking, and tell me which one was better. In June 2001, Tony Blair was re-elected. He'd won his first election victory in 1997. Four years, he had an election. He won the election, and one of the things that he was worrying about, looking back on his first term, particularly after he'd spent 6 weeks with the electorate. Our elections are mercifully quite a lot shorter than yours. He came back and he said, what the public are saying to me is, we want to give you another chance, we like you, we like your ideas, but we really want to see that you actually make a difference. We've watched you for 4 years, you talk well, you've got the right ideas, you give us confidence, but what happens? The National Health Service just looks like it did 4 years ago. Crime hasn't got any better, the trains don't run on time. They did say the school system had got a bit better, and it's partly for that reason that in June 2001, after that election victory, I got a call from the Prime Minister's office and went round to see him, and he said, I've got about 20 big things in domestic policy that I want to get done in the next 4 years. Will you design me a system to make sure they get done? Now, nobody's going to say no to an offer like that. I did say to him, if you want this to happen, you personally have to pay constant attention to it for the whole of the 4 years, whatever happens in the world. This was 3 months before September the 11th, 2001. He said he would do that, and to be fair to him, he did. So anyway, I was very excited about this opportunity to work in number 10, and I went out there and I thought, oh my God, how do I do that? Well, the first thing you've got to do in any job like that is get a few good people. So we got a small group of good people and built out from that. And over the summer between the election and September, when the sort of political season got going again, and after people had the summer break, we designed a system, and then we began to implement it. And of course, we didn't get it all right, and we refined it as we went along. And what I want to tell you is that story, how we did that, and how it had an impact. And at the end of it, Blair said it was the best reform he ever made of the government system, and it was a huge pleasure to work on this thing, because we started with a kind of theory, and then after about a year we had a theory and some good stories, and I'll tell you one or two of those. And then after about 2.5 years, we realized we had something which we mockingly called deliverology, that if you applied it to a problem, it worked. It was almost like science. So I just want to take you, through that story. So that's what it is. And when I've finished, you can ask me any question you like about what I've talked about, or if there's something you wish I'd talked about that I didn't, you can ask me about that. Or if you want to ask me about the details of the school reform, ask me about that. So we'll have a good half hour for discussion. But let me tell you the story. First of all, delivery is a big challenge. It's not just a big challenge in England, it's a big challenge around the developed world. And that's because there is a pressure from the public for enhanced outcomes. They look at the things that governments or public services provide and they say that's not good enough. We want that to be better. And if it's as good this year as it was last year, that's not good enough either, even if it was good last year, because expectations are rising. Secondly, they say we want to be treated like a customer. Just like we are by the best private sector organisations, when we interact with the government, we want to be treated like a customer. We want to be treated fairly, thoughtfully, without arrogance, without being patronised, and efficiently, and get good service. So we want service as well as outcomes. And finally, we don't want to pay any more taxes. So we want enhanced outcomes, we want better customer services, but we don't want to pay more for them. You put those three things together, and the pressure for any government around the world, and I can assure you this is a pressure felt literally in every continent, is to drive up performance without driving up the cost, or at least drive up performance faster than the cost goes up. So you've got to get productivity. How do you do that? Well, the first thing is you've got to have a long-term strategy, but if you're a politician, but it's also played out if you're a principal of a school that needs turning around, or you're running a state education system, you know that to do this, you've got to have a long-term strategy. But you also know that in order to have the long-term strategy and have people believe in it, you've got to get some short-term results, because otherwise nobody will think you've got any credibility. It's no good in the 21st century saying, we're going to fix this, it'll take 5 or 10 years, and in the meantime, if you could just be patient. It just doesn't work anymore. When they founded the National Health Service in England in 1948, they did say that. They said it'll take us a few years and this will work, just bear with us, and people were quite happy to do that. They're not anymore. So you've got this constant dilemma. This is one such leader falling through the gap. This is Gerhard Schröder, who was Chancellor of Germany until he lost the election 2 or 3 years ago, trying to reform the system, trying to get the benefit, but the gap widening all the time, and in the end, of course, he crashed through that gap. We've all felt pretty much like that at different times. The question, though, that one of the questions we had to answer at the beginning of the delivery unit for Blair was, what is delivery? What does it actually mean? And this is a chart I developed for the British Cabinet in 2002 to explain to them what we meant by delivery. And in England, tell me if this is true in your country or your state. In England, the politicians generally, but certainly in the Blair era, are pretty bold people. They want to be radical. Bold is Blair's favourite word, pretty much. We should have been bolder, he says, even now. So all the time he's saying, make the reform more radical, go up the vertical axis. And the permanent officials and some of the political advisors are saying, oh, we remember that. Last time we had one of your bold ideas, we just had this big controversy and there was no change. So we've been there. So they say, reduce the boldness, make it more pragmatic, less risky, take the risk out of it. The trouble is, if the citizens, as I was explaining, want higher performance and better customer service for the same amount of money, the status quo is in effect steady decline. Because if you're as good this year as last year, you've gone backwards. So you've got all these people in the system saying, reduce the boldness, but if they do that, they're defending the status quo, and the status quo isn't good enough. We know that isn't good enough. So you've got officials in Whitehall in London saying things like, well, couldn't we have a pilot program? Or why don't we commission some research? Or why don't we try it out in Scotland first? Things like that. So, unfortunately, that option doesn't work anymore because Scotland has its own parliament now. But there are lots of things you could do to reduce the risk. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, if you have that debate, it's fruitless because you're either debating controversy without impact or the status quo. Neither is what you want. So, bring in the horizontal axis, the quality of execution, how well you do it, and suddenly things begin to look a bit better. If you've got a not very radical reform, a kind of cautious thing, but you do it really well, you might get those improved short-term outcomes that you need to build credibility. So, for example, in the Blair first term, one of the reforms that we were engaged in the Department for Education was improving literacy performance in primary schools, in elementary schools. Now, there's a lot of knowledge about how to do that around the world. And in England, we've been talking about it since 1870. Why can't every child leave school age 11, leave elementary school age 11, able to read and write well? It's not a very radical thought. The only thing was, in 1870, we talked about it but didn't do it. And the same in 1918, and the same in 1944, and the same in 1967. So in 1997, we said, we're really going to do it this time. We knew that literacy standards had been the same for 50 years. 50 years. Imagine any other sector where standards stayed the same for 50 years. So doing it really well, it was all about execution, not particularly about the radical idea. So in any government system, having some cautious reforms that you execute well might be just what you need to deliver those short-term outcomes. And then, of course, the other bit of delivery is if you get a radical reform and you do it well, then you transform a system. And that's what we attempted to do, actually with some significant success in Blair's second term with the health service, which is now more popular than it's ever been since 1948, and the reforms are beginning to work. So if you get execution and the boldness to reform, you get transformation. And what I said to the ministers was, that's delivery, and if you're running a system, you want some things in the transformation box and some things in the improved outcome box. If everything in your portfolio is in the top right-hand corner, left-hand corner, the transformation box, that's too risky. If everything's down in the improved outcomes bit, that's not radical enough. And if everything's in the pale blue bit, you're failing. So that's what I mean by delivery. Now, the other thing you need to get delivery is you need to change the culture in the big bureaucracies that run government. And in the delivery unit, because we were a small number of people doing a very large number of very large things, we wanted to simplify everything. As you know very well, there are lots of people in government whose job it is to complicate things. So you need some simplifiers, otherwise everything just gets incredibly complicated. So we were the simplifiers for Blair. So we said, when Blair said to us, what kind of culture do I need in the civil service to make this happen in the government machine? We said, it's all about these 5 words: ambition, focus, clarity, urgency, and irreversibility. So let me just take you through those briefly. Ambition. If you're going to do those transformations, you need to be ambitious. It's quite risky to be ambitious for the reasons we've just been debating, but without it, how are you going to get transformation? So you need ambition, not just from the politicians, but through the system. And ambition, Blair's favourite phrase was step change rather than incremental change, a big leap forward. Ambition isn't very British, actually. If you go into the psychology, the subconscious psychology of the average British person, what they think is that everything gets a little bit better very, very slowly over a long time. That's really that's the basic psychology of the British. So they think there was Queen Elizabeth I, and she brilliantly defeated the Armada in 1588. And then 400 years later, we arrived at Queen Victoria, and that was pretty much the pinnacle of British achievement. We had a very large empire, and it had taken 350 years, and nothing much happened each year, but over time it got bigger. And then in the 20th century, America was the top nation, so we tried to forget about that. So that is basically the British psychology. And what we were trying to do was change that psychology. Believe that you can get things done. Not just say, oh, it's all too difficult, or the best we could do is get an increment here or an increment there. And you need ambition in how you do it as well as what you want to do. And then focus. Everybody, you all know this, because if you work in a government and organisation, there's things coming from outside all the time that distract you from your focus on the things that really matter. And this is the biggest reason why things get blocked in government, because the leadership gets distracted. Not just the top leader, but the people right through the system. So focusing on the priorities and being clear that they are priorities, which means being clear what aren't the priorities, is very difficult but very important. And in the work you're doing, again, you can see the many conflicting priorities with the ADP work or the work that goes with it. And then there's a third thing, clarity. In the British government system, in the civil service, there's lots of reasons for hiding bad news. It's just, partly it makes you feel uncomfortable, particularly if it's bad news about the program you're running, because it implies maybe you're not doing, or that people will think you're not doing your job very well. And so the brutal facts get pushed to the bottom of the filing tray, or swept under the carpet. And they certainly don't get passed on to the minister or the prime minister if you can avoid it, or at least that's the tradition. But the problem with hiding the brutal facts is that they pile up and eventually you get a crisis. Eventually it all goes horribly wrong, and it's much worse than it would have been if you'd dealt with it right at the beginning. So facing up to the brutal facts was a lot of what we did in the delivery unit with departments. We'd say, well, are you sure that's good news? Or don't you think we should deal with it now? How are you going to do it? Can we help? That kind of thing. So getting people to really know what's happening. And the data systems in government, certainly in 2001-2 in England, were terrible. This is how they measured road congestion. One of the things we were trying to do was reduce the amount of road congestion in England, which is a challenge at the best of times. It's one of the few benefits of higher oil prices, by the way. Anyway, we were trying to work on that. So we said to the Department for Transport, how do you know whether road congestion is getting worse or badly? And they said, This is true. They said, we have 13 people out there in the country who drive around the system, and then they phone in once every 2 years and tell us how it's going. It's true. When I explained this to the Minister of Transport, his face went pale. But anyway, we said we don't know anything about measuring road congestion, but we don't think that sounds like the best possible way of doing it. What about, have you heard of the global positioning system? And they said, oh yes. And now, a year and a half later, and still working now, they could measure the road congestion on every M road and A road, like all your interstates, hourly. They could tell you where it was. They can inform the drivers of what's going on, where the pile-ups are, where the traffic is. And although there are more cars on the road, actually it all flows a lot better. So getting the data is really important. Urgency. Look, I told that everybody knows the citizens are impatient for change, but inside government there's all these reasons for delay. So you've got to keep coming back to the urgency. And if somebody isn't really pushing the urgency, all the incremental causes of delay will cause delay. I like this quote from the American racing driver: if everything seems under control, you're not going fast enough. This was Mario Andretti. It's a very good sense of what it should feel like in government. And by the way, he's still alive. Irreversibility. You see, you've seen this as well. There's lots and lots of reforms that happen. They start promisingly, they're the flavour of the month. The politicians love them, the officials love them. They begin to make a change. The system begins to say, actually, this may be quite a good idea. And then something comes up, the priorities change, everything shifts, and the world moves on, and the change goes back to how it was before, as though you dropped a stone in a lake and then the ripples go away. What you need for these things is irreversible change. Really see it through. And there are lots of dangers. Just let me pick out one. One of the dangers, one of the threats to getting irreversible reform is that you celebrate too soon. You need to celebrate because it's a big effort making any progress, and when you make progress, you need to celebrate. But when you have the big party at the end of at that point, obviously the people who've been working really hard come to the party and then slump back and rest on their laurels. But the other thing is that the people who never liked your change, they come to the party as well, and they come to the party for this reason: they know that after the party, you'll go away, and they enjoy it. So you've got to avoid celebrating success too soon. You're doing some really big changes. You've got to push it right through till it can't go back. So getting that celebration, that's what, by the way, it's one of the mistakes we made in England with the primary school elementary literacy program. We got big jumps in 2 or 3 years in a row. Really impressive. And then we kept saying, we finished primary schools, now it's about secondary schools. It was a big mistake. The thing dissipated, the data plateaued for 2 or 3 years, and we suffered as a result. We should have seen it through. Right. So I just want to tell you how the delivering it worked. So that's the kind of context, that's the kind of culture and demands we're facing. But how did it actually work? Well, the first thing is we needed a very, very simple system. So for each of the things that we were doing, we said, what are you trying to do? Just tell us what success would look like. In 2005, 4 years on, tell us where the data will have got to. It's here now, you want it to be there. What's the target? We chose to publish those targets. You don't have to, but we chose to publish them because we thought we'd put more pressure on the system to actually deliver. But it did. It's a risk politically because you miss some of them. So for every goal, there was a target. For example, reduce crime by 30% by 2005, or improve the reliability of the railways from X to Y by 2005. So clear targets, measurable. Secondly, we said to the civil servants responsible, you set your target, so we know what you're trying to achieve, and you know what you're trying to achieve, and everybody out there knows what you're trying to achieve. Can you just show us the plan for getting it done? And if you ask somebody for a plan to hit a target, they can't say they haven't got one, even though they didn't have one. So they dash off back to the department and write one. And after a while, I said, could we have a template? And we said, no, it's your plan. And then they said, well, is that a kind of essay with a nice glossy cover? And we said, no, it's not that. It's a plan that you're really going to use day to day. It might have jam on the corners and coffee stains. We don't mind about that, but we want it to be an operational plan. And there are two things that really matter. One is the milestone. So what are the big steps that need to be taken? And when do they need to be taken? your estimate of when the big decisions, big pieces of implementation have to occur, so a kind of timetable. And then the second thing is the trajectory. How is the data going to change? If your data is here in 2001 and it's got to be there in 2005, how will it change? Just draw the line for us. So on crime, for example, will it take a long time to get going and then build up? Will it be directly correlated to police numbers? Or will it be related to some other things? Is crime worse in winter or summer? So we had lots of debates like that. And generally speaking, what people in Whitehall do, the first thing they do is they dash back to their department, they get out their really sophisticated analytical equipment, it's called a ruler, and they draw a straight line. So, trajectories. And we worked on those, and then once we got them, we then helped them design a monthly report that came to us and through us to the Prime Minister. So a monthly report showing progress against trajectory, and if it's off trajectory, why is it off trajectory? If it's on trajectory, what's going well, what are the challenges ahead? So the Prime Minister gets a 4-page report every month on each one of these big goals saying, this is how it looks. It's in a standard format, so it really takes in no more than 2 or 3 minutes to understand, and then 3 bullet points about what's going well and 3 bullet points about what the challenges are. So regular monthly reporting. I can't emphasize too strongly how important routines are to getting things done. Government is driven by crises mostly, but it's the routines that deliver results. Then we had, every quarter, we had stock takes, we called them, or that's what Blair called them. Prime Minister and a couple of advisors sit on one side of the table, the cabinet table in Downing Street, and on the other side of the table, the Minister and 3 or 4 advisors of his or hers. And they get a presentation from me on PowerPoint saying, here's the targets, here are the trajectories, and here's actual progress, and this is what it looks like, and this is what we think. And then a debate between the Prime Minister and the Minister. Now that is a simple performance management conversation that any large business will do naturally. But for British government, that was an innovation. Because normally, we've had Prime Ministers since 1720 something, and when they meet ministers, they've talked about Parliament, they've talked about their colleagues, they've talked about who's in and who's out, they've talked about the media, they've talked about policy, they've talked about strategy, legislation, whatever. What they didn't do was talk about the data. They didn't talk about how things were going. I can remember the sense of enormous triumph the first time Blair said to a minister, that looks like a plateau to me, Alan, what are you going to do about it? Or you're off trajectory. Imagine developing a language among politicians like that. That's what happened in the stock takes. Blair liked the health ones, he liked the education ones, he quite liked the crime ones, and he hated the transport ones. And he didn't really believe we could make the railways better, but you'll see in a minute that we did have some impact. Then the third routine we got was we reviewed these things regularly, and I'll explain that in a few moments. And then out of these various reviews, the monthly reports, the stock takes, and the review process, which I'll explain, you would identify problems that needed fixing, and you then took the action. And the result of that was that things that would have gone wrong got identified sooner and fixed. So in a way, we were a risk management system as well as a delivery system. And then we did delivery reports every 6 months that compared progress right across the portfolio for Blair and for the Chancellor of the Exchequer and for the ministers. And I'll show you that later on, so we'll come to that soon. Just a crucial thing in the delivery plan is, how is this going to work? It's not just a set of milestones. You actually need, the thing at the core of it is what we call the delivery chain. I just want to explain that. It's a very, very simple concept. When I was first in the Department for Education, our minister, a guy called David Blunkett, stood up in Parliament and he said he was going to make sure that every child learned to read and write well by 2002, or 80% of them by 2002 and more after that. He was going to raise the performance from 57% to 80%. It was a big claim. Now, at one level, that's the kind of thing politicians do. But if you just step back and think about that for a moment, you've got a minister standing in Parliament on the banks of the Thames, claiming to be able to influence what goes on in the head of an 11-year-old in Liverpool or Newcastle. It's quite an odd thing to do when you think about it like that. Now, the delivery chain is the connection between the child's brain in Liverpool and the Secretary for Education in London. So what are the connections? In what way can he influence that, what goes on in that boy's or girl's head? Well, the answer is it can influence the teacher, and the principal can influence the teacher, and the local authority can influence the principal, and the local authority can be influenced by the regional director of the National Literacy Strategy, who can be influenced by the director of the National Literacy Strategy, who can be influenced by me, and I answer to the Secretary for Education. So we have a very simple delivery chain. There might be another delivery chain, because what goes on in the brain of that 11-year-old will also be influenced by his or her parents, and the parents might be influenced, for example, by television. So we could think about television advertising, for example. So there might be some other delivery chains, but unless we can draw those delivery chains, nothing will happen. The minister will say what he says, and what goes on in the head of the 11-year-old will be influenced by everything except the minister. So you've got to be able to do the delivery chain. There is no delivery without a delivery chain. The interesting thing about these delivery chains is they're usually not direct line management relationships. For example, the local authority in England doesn't directly line manage the school principal. And certainly the regional director of the National Literacy Strategy didn't line manage the local authority. So these are not line management relationships, but they are relationships, and they're delivery relationships. And the reviews I talked about, what we did in a few weeks, very quickly, was review each of the links in the delivery chain. So we began by, for whatever piece of delivery it was, what's the delivery chain? And then we reviewed them. Which ones are strong, which ones are weak? If they're weak, what are we going to do about it? Very simple stuff. So these are the kinds of things that need to be thought through. And the review process, most review processes in government are far too slow. So the question is, how do you get fast reviews? We have a thing called the Audit Commission in England. They do beautiful reports. They're really, really good. And they take 2 years from conception to publication, 2 years. Well, we didn't have time. We were in 2001. We've got to deliver by 2005. We don't have 2 years to do a review, even if it's good. So we said to the Audit Commission, after how long do you know 90% of what is in your final report? The answer was 1 month. So we just did the month and tried to be 90% right and then act on it. And this was a really important part of the process. Now, second thing is, you can design all the systems you like in the world, you can master deliverology, you can have a PhD in deliverology, but unless you get the relationships right, it'll all fail. So a lot of our work was, how do you get the relationships right? And one thing to do is to think about how you persuade the people on the receiving end of your work that you're going to help them, that you're a positive thing, that it's a win-win. For the Prime Minister, this was an obvious win. Whatever you're focused on, we're focused on your priorities. Tony Blair had to deal with the aftermath of September the 11th, 2001, a war in Afghanistan, the build-up and then the war in Iraq and then the post-Iraq. All these very demanding, difficult things. And that's before I get on to other things like the economy and whatever else he's got on in his life, not to mention the European Union. So all those things are going on. And what he said about it at the end was, the reason he liked the delivering it so much is wherever he was in the world and whatever was distracting him and taking up his time, he knew that if he woke up in the night and said, oh my God, what's happening to the health service reforms? He'd say, oh, it's okay, there's a delivering it, I can check. So our motto to him was, delivery never sleeps, we're always doing this. And by the way, we never ever read, we might read the newspapers as a kind of ordinary consumer, but we were never distracted by whatever the headline was. The other people whose job it was to do that. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown at the time, Blair and Brown had a pretty tense relationship. They get on very well now, but back then it was edgy. So how do we couldn't work unless we're getting the Treasury lined up with us. So what's the sell to Gordon Brown? The answer is, you're spending a lot of money. We're going to help you make sure it delivers results. Your credibility depends on it. And that worked. And then the cabinet ministers, imagine you're the Minister of Health, you're a friend of Tony Blair's, you've known him for years. He appoints you Minister of Health, says, I want you to deliver this, Alan. And then somebody from number 10 comes to check up on you. Actually, it's not what you want. So they were very suspicious. So how do we persuade them? Well, the answer was, we said to them, you and the Prime Minister agree what you want to get done. We're going to help you make your bureaucracy do what you want it to do anyway. So we're your ally getting it done. That leaves us with one small problem, which is how do we sell ourselves to the top civil servants who we've now said to the Minister, we're going to make them do what you want them to do anyway. Well, two things. One is, you've got a set of priorities. They're fixed by the Prime Minister. They're your Minister's priorities, and you're going to be held to account for them. So we're going to do two things for you. We're going to make sure that Blair doesn't keep changing his mind, which he did do in the first term, which is great if you're a civil servant because you've got the direction. And secondly, when something goes wrong, we're going to help you fix it, and what's more, we're going to give you the credit. And suddenly they quite like it. So we thought through the relationships, and again, this deliverology, the techniques are no good without the relationships. Just want to tell you a couple of stories. I think you call it emergency rooms, but hospitals have accident and emergency units where people go if they're in a car accident or if they cut their thumb while doing woodwork at home or whatever it might be. And in England, I'm sure this doesn't happen in America, in England you often had to wait 10 hours to be seen. There were stories in the newspapers of people waiting on trolleys in corridors to be seen in the accident and emergency unit. So it was undermining the credibility of the hospitals. And it's not a small thing. 12 million people see accident and emergency units every year in England. Or at least 12 million incidents. Some of them are the same people back every Friday night after they've been hit over the head with a beer glass. But nevertheless, it's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And 12 million people, that's nearly a quarter of the population. It's about a fifth of the population. And of course, they're all related to other people. So it's a big issue. So we set a target that nobody would wait more than 4 hours. Nobody would wait more than 4 hours. 4 hours is still a long time if you sit in an accident emergency waiting room. But if we knew that if we got the maximum to 4, the average would be under 2, and that would be pretty much all right. So the target was very clear, and we announced it. It had actually been first announced before the delivery unit was set up, and then it was re-announced when we were set up. And then what you can see is for the next 2 years, absolutely nothing happened. 80% of people were being seen within 4 hours, and 20% weren't. 20% of 12 million people waiting more than 4 hours is a lot. So we did one of those reviews of this, the month-long reviews that I described to you. And we went to a hospital in Oxford, which was terrible, and we went to a hospital in Peterborough, which was brilliant. It was already meeting the target. And from the hospital in Peterborough, and checking the delivery chain, we worked out how to meet the target. And from the hospital in Oxford, we learned what not to do to meet the target. And as often, it was about relationships at the top of the hospital management. Anyway, we then made 3 recommendations to the Minister: give it more priority, check the data regularly, and introduce some incentives, especially in the published data you put out. Make sure that hospitals know you care about this. So actually publish the data on this hospital by hospital. And what you can see is that had a big impact. The Department of Health began monitoring it weekly. The A&E stuff was published, and you can see the jump, just the publication jump, brought this big growth. And then, having jumped up, everybody rested on their laurels again, and you can see it plateaued out again for a few months. And we had one of those stock takes where the Health Minister, now a guy called John Reid, came to see Tony Blair in about October, November of 2003. And Blair said, well, what are the incentives to hit this target? And John Reid said, well, hospital chief executives can lose their job, the data is published. And Blair said, no. What are the positive incentives for the people who are doing well? And John Reid said, well, we haven't really thought about that. And Blair said, well, why don't you go and think about that? A month later, he came back with a positive incentive scheme, rewards for accident and emergency departments that moved towards the target, a kind of growth model, progress towards the target, where you got capital money to rebuild your unit if you were making progress. And at the end of it, you could get £500,000 if you hit the target on time, on standard. And look what happened. So they pretty much hit the target on time, on standard. The story's simple. You've got to do the right things, adjust the policy as you go along. All the time you're managing performance, weekly management of performance, sending in experts to hospitals that were struggling with it, and therefore tailoring the support. So it's simple stuff, but without the delivering it routine, it wouldn't have happened. So these are the lessons, and I've mentioned them in passing. You call it fall, we call it autumn, but the same thing happens, whichever you call it, the leaves fall off the trees. This is a problem for our railways, because the leaves fall onto the railway lines, and it rains, and then they get a bit mushy. And so the train drivers are worried about sliding because the friction is less. So they slow down, so the train is late. You don't really want to know this, do you? If you ever get a job in England and you're late that morning and you want to explain to your colleagues why you're late, just say leaves on the line. Works. Actually, amazingly, it works any time of year. When we started the delivery unit, what you can see is, if you look at the years before 2000, you can see that performance ticks along, and then every autumn there is a dip. That's that big dip. This is one of my favourite graphs. And then in the autumn of 2000, so 6 months before the delivery unit set up, at the same time as autumn, there was a crash at Hatfield, north of London, a rail crash, and the system kind of went into seizure, and you can see that it went down to 55% of trains arriving on time. It's really bad. It was a really bad time, and there was a kind of nervous breakdown combined with autumn. So we were set up, and we went to the Department for Transport, and we said, well, how do you run this railway? And they said, well, we've privatised it. So there's all these train companies, 22 of them, and then we've privatised the track, and another company owns that, and it's not our job anymore. It's their job. So don't come to us about delivery, it's out there now. And we said, hang on, you spend most of the money on the railways. Can't you act as a kind of shareholder? You're making a big investment. And they said, no, we really can't do this job, it's over to them now. And then we said, well, what happens in autumn? And they described this process of the leaves. And we said to them, one of the things we tried to do in the delivery was come up with a killer question. And the killer question on autumn was, how come every year autumn takes you by surprise? We know. You know the leaves are going to fall off the trees. They did it last year, do you remember? And the year before. So, amazingly, we persuaded them to do a plan for autumn. And the plan, at the centre of the plan, was this machine from Poland. It was a wonderful machine. And it went round the railway tracks, putting resin on the tracks before the leaves fell off. So that when the leaves fell off and it rained, the train driver didn't need to worry because the resin would add to the friction, and so they could keep going faster. What you can see is, in 2002, which was a really bad year, so you can see there's the Hatfield crash, and the next year was quite a lot better, but still awful. Then the next year it was worse. That's because on one night, on the 18th of October 2002, 50% of all the leaves in the country fell in a single storm. I don't know how they knew that, but they did. It was really bad news. And that's when we got them to do a plan for autumn. The following year, they implemented their autumn plan, and you can see the progress. And then the following year, the first year, they got the machine from Poland, they ran it around the railway tracks. They made one mistake, they had it the wrong way around. So it didn't really work, but the next year, what you can see is it worked. And then they I don't know about how much you know about the history of railways, but the first passenger train in the whole world went from my hometown of Liverpool to Manchester in 1830. It ran over the Home Secretary, unfortunately, but nevertheless, it moved. And 40 years later, you had a transcontinental railway, miraculously. But anyway, in 2004, so 174 years after they invented the passenger railway in England, they came up with another brilliant insight, apart from a plan for autumn, and that's this. You know, if you're on a railway platform, a guy blows a whistle, and then that's the sign that you're supposed to get on the train because it's going to leave. Until 2004, they blew that whistle at the time the train was supposed to leave. So, of course, it then takes you 2 minutes to get on the train, 3 minutes, so the train is already late by the time it leaves the station. So they invented blowing the whistle 2 minutes early. Fantastic. So this is the kind of thing I had to deal with. Anyway, railway performance is still improving in England, and now the problem is not that the trains are late, but that they're overcrowded. I've been through all this. Now, I told you I wanted to explain, and this is my final little bit really, I just want to explain to you how we monitored the whole program. So I've talked about how we monitored each individual bit of it. I'm giving you a couple of stories, but this is how we monitored it. We wanted to assess for Blair how his whole program looked. So we wanted a way of measuring things that could compare them even though they were different. So how do you compare progress on railway performance to school test results? Or how do you compare reduction in crime versus managing the immigration system. We wanted a system where Blair would know whether he was on track to meet his 2005 targets. And this is what we came up with. So let me just explain this for a moment. If you want to know whether something's going to happen, so not whether it's happening now, because you can look at the data to do that, but if you want to know whether it is going to happen in 5 years, will this be delivered on time? We decided you needed to know 4 things. How difficult is it, the degree of challenge? Is it very hard, hard, medium hard, or low challenge, which we didn't have many of those. So that's one judgment, 4-point scale. Second thing is, now you know how hard it is, how good is the plan? How good is the implementation system? Have you got a performance management process? Have you got some way of checking whether this is happening? Seems to be another key thing. And again, we can measure that on a 4-point scale down the bottom there. Is it red because it's failing? Is it green because it's on track? Is it amber red, amber green? You have to have a 4-point scale, because social scientists will tell you if you have a 3-point scale, everybody chooses the middle one. Then capacity to drive progress. So even if you've got a good plan and a performance management system, have you got the money, the relationships, the skills in the system to make this happen? You might have a really bad relationship with a union, for example, that would completely undermine capacity to deliver. And then the stage of delivery, are you inventing the policy? Are you in early implementation? Are you in late implementation? Or have you achieved irreversible progress? So 4-point scales. And then I'll show you how this works in a minute. Having made those judgments in a debate with the people actually responsible for the policy, we then say, well, what's recent performance? Because that's a kind of proxy for are they making progress now? And we arrive at, again, a judgment on using the traffic light system on the overall likelihood of delivery. If you put this system together, I can do this for progress towards the railway target, the crime target, the education targets, whatever they might be. And we did that in the delivery unit. So we had debates with all the departments that are involved in our program, and then inside the delivery unit, we'd sit down for a day. It was really frustrating, really hard work, saying, well, is that better than this? Are we sure that the progress towards the crime target is better than the progress towards the railway target, or is it the other way around? And we had really good debates, like those moderation debates you have in education systems on really good assessment. And we'd arrive at a technical judgment. So here's a filled-in one. This is a very high challenge. The planning isn't very good, and the performance management isn't very good. But actually, the capacity to drive progress is there. So if they got their planning right, they could make progress. Second stage of delivery, so they're beginning to get it into implementation. Recent performance is good. So overall, we're judging that they can probably fix their planning with a bit of help from us, and that's amber-green, or we call it amber, that middle bit on a traffic light. Amber-green, it's likely to happen. Not certainty, but it's quite good. Then you can do that for the whole department. So education had 5 targets. This is what their report looked like. So they've got 5 targets. PSA stands for Public Service Agreement target. There's 5 of them. All of them are either high challenge or very high challenge. So these are difficult things to do. Mostly the Department for Education is good at planning, but they've got one bit of the department that's done a really bad plan. However, they had big capacity issues in 2004, this July 2004. They've got a problem with the union on testing. They've got various other conflicting things. And they've got an implementation system that's slightly lost the plot. So problems on capacity. Stage of delivery is quite far on. But we're saying, and they've got difficult targets, and their capacity is weak, so they're red. They're not likely to deliver on 3 of their 5 targets. This is quite a useful, if you're the Secretary of State for Education, this is a really useful thing. If you're the permanent secretary, the head civil servant in that department, this is a very useful thing, because you can see how well you're doing. The last column is how well you're doing compared to the other 20-odd things in the league table. So you can see you're not doing very well. You've got 2 20s and an 18. But the interesting thing is, if you're the Secretary for Education, you can say, well, how come, at least we're very good at planning. How come we've got one bad plan? Can't we fix that, at least? And the 3 slabs of red there, that is encouraging attendance among secondary school students, making sure they turn up every day to school. So it's quite a difficult thing to do. You know that. We all know that. But at least you can have a good plan. At least you can begin to put capacity in place, and then you might make the target. And they did make progress. Now, you can do that for each of the departments, and then you can put it all in one league table for Blair, where you can compare the whole portfolio. So if you're the Prime Minister, in July 2004, you get this chart. That is your whole program on one sheet of paper. And at the top there is improving patient care for cancer and coronary heart disease. Really good plan. Capacity to drive progress, excellent. Stage 3 of delivery. It's already a low challenge because they've almost hit the target. So that's going to happen. He can be confidently going out there and saying, we're going to hit that target. And down the bottom is the attendance in secondary schools. He's got big problems. He can then direct our attention, the delivery unit's attention, to the things with red in them. Now, the other thing you need to know if you're a Prime Minister, so the beauty of this is you're comparing unlike things on a similar scale. It's a very, very, very useful thing indeed. And they're still doing this. The other thing you need to know as the Prime Minister, well, let's really simplify it for the Cabinet. Politicians are simple people. Is it really all working? So we merge all the green and all the red, and we say, in December 2003, your programme is 47% on track. And in July 2004, it's 62% on track. And in December 2004, it's 83% on track. And in May 2005, he has an election and wins. There's only one thing to say about this, though. If it was that good, and that is a fair assessment of the targets, how come the British people weren't dancing in the streets? Why didn't they say, this is absolutely fantastic? Whereas actually they were kind of grumbling away. Well, it's partly the Iraq War and all of that, but there were other things, and I just want to take you through that. Firstly, it took a long time. Remember, people are impatient. Secondly, it was uneven across the country. So if nationally crime has fallen, but in your area crime is going up, you don't care about the national data. That doesn't make you happy. Thirdly, the agenda in the media shifts. So as you hit all these targets, the media starts writing about something else. They don't write, the government has tremendously delivered all its targets. They say, what about this, and what about that, and what about the other? Thirdly, some of the targets weren't that well designed. Most of them were good, but not all of them were good. So let's take the railway target. The railway target was quite well designed. It measured whether the trains were arriving on time. But if there was repairs on a track, and if those repairs were notified in advance, and therefore you were going to change the timetable, that wasn't taken into account in the data. So if you're on a line like from Norwich to London that's being repaired every week, actually you're getting lots of delays, even though technically your trains are arriving on time. So that kind of thing. It's a big controversy. The doctors hated all this. The teachers weren't delighted with it. So if they're grumbling to their patients or students or the parents of the students, even if the data is going in the right direction, the parents might think, well, what's going on? Or the patient. I went to my GP, my local doctor, during this time, and I said, as a way of opening a conversation, I said, this must be the best time there's ever been to be a doctor. And it took me an hour to get out of there, and we hadn't even dealt with my health issue. And then the other thing is this. You see, what we took over a lot of awful systems, and we made them adequate. Like fine enforcement. In 2001, if you got a fine handed down by a court, 50% of them were collected and the other 50% weren't collected. That is terrible. By the time we finished, it was 75% were being collected. That's better. Blair said, let's put out a press release. And I said, are you sure you want to tell the British people that we don't collect 25% of fines? It's not good. It's at best adequate. And a lot of the stuff was like that. The railways, similarly, it was awful to adequate. When you go awful to adequate, the people don't dance in the streets. They say, you should have done that years ago. You've got to go further to good and to great, and then people will dance in the streets. And that's really where I want to finish. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you very much. Look, we have 15 minutes. You can ask me any question you like. If I don't know the answer, I'll say so. But I'd love to debate any of that with you, or if you want to relate it to your own circumstances, feel free. So who would like to be? There's a microphone near the front and one or two in the middle there. I thought you were going to the microphone. Hiya.
I'd be glad to. We're having a kind of a tug of war between adequate standards and really, really high expectations. And And I think that is a picture of that. Adequate, we're still grumbling. So what would your risk have been, or could you have predicted your risk if you had set your targets much higher?
Yeah, this was an endless debate we had, because at the start of the political level, as I was saying earlier, most of the politicians, certainly in the Blair administration anyway, wanted to be bold. But once you start publishing targets, it creates massive political risk. So the politicians constantly went flip-flopped, basically, in the debate inside government between wanting to be bold and ambitious and setting bold targets, and then saying targets are risky and dangerous and we don't want them. And we had this debate all the time. And really, in the end, my argument is you've got to go for it. You've got to set the target ambitiously, because even if you miss it, it will help you make progress towards it. And you might get some political flack for missing the target, but if you've really improved the system, in the end, people will notice. But the second thing to say is, going back to the map of delivery, you can't do that on everything. So if you're running a part of a system, you might want one or two really transformative goals, but then keep the risk out of some of the other areas, because otherwise you'll kill yourselves and your system. And then there's, I'm trying to relate it to AVP stuff. How far ahead you set the target, where you put interim targets is important. How you manage the transition and how you manage the communication is really important. And I know this is a really big issue for states, thinking about where you set the standards. But sometime, somebody has to have the courage to say, our kids are going to leave high school with the standards that the people in the best in the world leave with. Otherwise, America's not going to make it. So somebody has to take that on, but you then need to be clear when you're setting the deadline for bringing those in, and you need a way of explaining that. You need a story, a language, a narrative that explains why you're doing it, and you've got to keep repeating it. I didn't go into the communication side of this, but winning the communication battle, particularly when there's always opposition to these things, is really, really important part of delivery. Sometimes you get commentaries on government that say there's kind of real government, and then over here there's communication. It's not like that. The two have to be integrated. And you've got to have a story. And we were lucky. We worked for Tony Blair. I mean, he is the master narrator of what's going on. Absolutely brilliant. It's one of the challenges for Gordon Brown coming after him, is how do you keep that quality of narration? So my advice to you would be, on something as important as end of high school leaving standards, in the end you've got to go for it, because the world out there is changing. You need to get the standards set. You need to set yourselves a reasonable but challenging timetable for getting there, and then you need a really good implementation plan and narrative that you can keep telling as you make progress towards the implementation. And maybe if that's your goal, taking some of the risk out, some of the other things the education system is doing at the same time. You can't do everything at once. Any other questions? Yes?
Yes. Could you please address your working relationships with the colleges and universities, and where they fell in your chain and the delivery chain, and any other anecdotal information that we can gather and learn from?
Yes. I mean, in the delivery unit time, actually, because of the targets that were chosen, the universities and colleges were not a big part of that. So in the delivery unit time, we weren't, but Blair didn't set any target for the universities in his set of priorities, but he did. The reason he didn't is because he wanted to bring in a huge reform of student funding, which was incredibly controversial and went through Parliament by 5 votes in 2003. So he nearly lost his job over it. So it wasn't that he didn't care about it, but it was at the what's the policy stage rather than how we're going to get it done stage. So that was what the relationship with the universities was about. But if I go back to the previous stage of my work in the education department, we did have a lot to do with colleges and universities. And when we introduced the national literacy and numeracy programs in primary school, we did need to change the way the colleges of education worked. And we we made one mistake. We left it a year too late. We should have started with the College of Education sooner. But we got one thing right, which was we specified that in any course of teacher education, you had to teach the students how to teach reading and writing in accordance with how we were changing the schools. So you couldn't run a teacher education program that wasn't aligned with the core program that was changing the schools. We had leverage over that many American systems don't have, because we controlled the money for teacher education. We had it in an agency called the Teacher Training Agency, and they allocated the money to universities only when the universities agreed to meet these criteria. So we had a piece of leverage, and that was very important. In terms of our relationships, you can't always have good relationships with everybody. We know this in government. But you can always explain to people why, so you can win the argument, or at least you can make the argument and you can make the change. And the interesting thing is, on quite a lot of these changes, the people who resist it, when you've made it, they say, I wish we'd done that years ago. Indeed, we used to go around Whitehall saying, that, how do you know you've delivered? The answer is, people tell you two things. One, they say, we wish we'd done this years ago. And secondly, they tell you it was their idea. So that's proof that you've delivered. So what we did was communicate actually quite well with the College of Education. We didn't always agree with them. We imposed this curriculum on teacher education in effect. But after a while, they got to quite like it, particularly when we invested significantly in reforming the teacher education program more broadly, incentivizing students to go into teacher education and improving the quality of student coming into teacher education programs. So it was a kind of investment for reform, as I would call it. Yes?
Would you comment on the sustainability of the work that you've just done? Is it being carried into the new administration? And it's so compelling. The question really is whether it would stay and continue delivering the same kind of information.
Yes. It is being used in the new administration, and not only that, it's being used in lots of administrations around the world. So the Premier in Ontario, Dalton McGuinty, uses it. The Mayor of Los Angeles has an adapted version of it. The Government of New South Wales has a version of it. The Prime Minister and Cabinet in Holland have just introduced a delivery unit. So this is, because this is a post hoc rationalisation. It didn't feel as clear and simple as that when we were doing it, because we were inventing it as we went along. But once you got to the end of it, you thought, why wouldn't you do that? I've never, ever presented that to a leading politician who didn't say, why wouldn't we do that? So it's conceptually simple when you put it on PowerPoint. It's really difficult to do in practice, partly because the techniques are, you need to learn how to use them. And secondly, in the end, it's all in the detail. When you make those red and green judgments, it's quite easy to be soft. You say, actually, I really like the health minister. I don't want to give him a slab of red. And my staff would say to me, well, it doesn't matter whether you like him or not. It's red. So we have to have that. So you need the rigour to be built into the system. And that's hard. And then the second bit, as I was emphasising earlier, getting the relationships so that people will trust you. So if you're the health minister, you've got to trust that those judgments are broadly right, because it's going to be presented to the cabinet, and they're going to see how you're doing. So you have to build a quality of relationship where you can have that debate. And so I spent a lot of time with the staff working on relationships, not banging the table, no shouting, no criticisms. We're not arrogant just because we work for the Prime Minister. We're, in fact, humility is our watchword. We had this guy, and we recruited him from a major consultancy, brilliant bloke. And in his first month, he went to the Home Office that deals with crime and all that, and he really upset them. He came back to me and said, I think I've had a really bad meeting with them. And he said, do you think I was right? And I said, you may well have been right, but they're really upset with you. They wrote to me complaining about him. That was the only complaint I got all the time I was doing that job. What did I do? Well, I read this letter. I wrote back to the guy in the Home Office before I spoke to the colleague, and I said, really helpful to have feedback on my staff. I can't manage without it. And I appreciate the courage of writing to the Prime Minister's advisor in this way. It's very helpful. Then I showed this bloke the letter. He read it, went white. He said, I think I'd better go and apologise. And I said, that would be a really good plan. So he goes and apologises. It goes well. He comes back and says, I think it was all right. And then he said, but Michael, I think I need humility training. So I said, I said, well, I'll see what I can do. Anyway, without him knowing, I got somebody to Google humility training. And there in North Oxfordshire, costing £3,000 for 3 days, there was a programme in humility training, and I sent him. And he came back humble. It's fantastic. I've met him recently, he's still humble, and I didn't need to tell the staff because the message kind of got round. It was £3,000 very well spent, because you've got to get those relationships right. So we did lots of small things like that to make sure that because if you work for the Prime Minister, you can always get in somebody's diary. You can always get them to answer their telephone. But when you get in the room or get the person at the other end of the line, particularly if it's an important person, you're on your own. It's how good you are. So the way I used to explain it is, with prime ministerial authority, you can spend it, you can use it up, or you can invest it. And every conversation like that is an opportunity to invest it, build the Prime Minister's credibility. And if you're a really good person who has a great conversation, finishes early, is clear, knows what they're talking about, you build the Prime Minister's credibility. If you shout and berate somebody, and they complain to their minister, and the minister complains to the Prime Minister, you undermine the Prime Minister. So we invested prime ministerial authority, and Blair loved that. And at the end he said he personally never had a single complaint about the delivering it in the whole that time, and it's because we worked on the relationships. So the sustainability depends on the systems, being clear what the mission is, and the relationships. In the Brown administration it's a bit tougher because you've got some things. Deliverology works for changing big services. It doesn't work for managing the way out of a housing crisis. House prices falling, that deliverology won't solve that problem. So a lot of his big priorities are in that area at the moment. So it's getting a bit less attention, but it's still got the targets and it's still doing the same things. Yeah.
I have a question also about sustainability, not about the system, but about the reforms that you're aiming your system at, or you aimed your system at. How do you mentioned irreversibility at one point. How do you craft strategies that really will lead to irreversible reform, keep the focus on the priorities that span leadership changes?
Yeah, this is hard. The short answer is two things. One is, if you publish some targets, but it's the same overall government. So the Blair-Brown government is now in its well into its 12th year. If you publish some targets, when the minister changes, the health service is still committed to hitting that target, or the Home Office or the Education Department. So the targets actually help bring continuity if you publish them some way out. That's point one. Secondly, in the end, you have to persuade the whole government that they depend on this collectively, which is easier in a cabinet system actually than in many of the way US states or the federal government is designed. But if you can get the whole government to understand that they sink or swim with this, if there are ministerial changes, actually it's easier. But of course, in the end, it's about leadership. And Blair, Blair's capacity to communicate outwards was reflected in his capacity to communicate inwards inside his government. So I was lucky working for an extremely talented politician. Gordon Brown is struggling with that because he's being pulled this way and that by crises, and it's harder to get that same consistency. But those are the things that matter at the political level. And then at the administrative level, what you need is to make sure that people, and this is a management challenge that you face in any organisation, that you have completer finishers, people who are going to see the thing through to the end. People who see that part where it maybe goes out of the limelight, but really making it happen, and they get their reward from seeing the citizens benefit rather than from getting headlines in the newspapers. Yes?
What observation do you have on the delivery map in education in the United States versus your country, especially with state, federal, and local governance?
Look, it's difficult in this country. I mean, you revolted against the British, and then, as a reaction, you invented a constitution that made life difficult for government. That was the point. So you separate the powers, you separate the federal from the state does the same thing from the district. That was the course you chose. Now, I have to admit, over 200 odd years, it's worked pretty well, so I don't knock it. But when you want to do a big change, a parliamentary system is a lot easier. If you've got a good Prime Minister with a majority in Parliament, you can change the law. I mentioned the higher education law in answer to a question. That was one of very few times when Blair nearly lost a piece of legislation. But most of the time, if you want to change the law, you can change the law. So it's hard. It's much harder in this country, I think, to make change. And what I notice, historically speaking, is that certain things reach a tipping point in America where people think that is the right thing to do. It happened with welfare reform in the 1990s. You know, it began with a few experiments in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then suddenly everybody was doing it. And it's about to happen with standards for the end of high schools because of you. So you have to work harder to create the coalitions of interest that will drive the change. I think that's easier in England because in the end, if you've got a charismatic leader, he can or she can, like Thatcher, she can take on pretty much the whole country. And if it works, everybody will follow through. They'll say, why didn't we do that years ago, like they did with the Thatcher union reforms or the Blair health service reforms. Here in this country, you've got to work harder to build the coalition before you get started. And I think a lot of government gets focused on that. That's why you get presidents talking about a bully pulpit in a way that you don't get prime ministers talking about, because you've got to persuade people in lots of different positions to come around. But the principles of delivery are exactly the same. You just made it harder for yourselves. Yeah.
Picking up on that last question about the tipping point, this is the tipping point for the leadership to be on board and get the right policies enacted, but the external partners and the in the field, teachers, principals, superintendents. We spent a conversation this morning talking about political will, public will. Thoughts on, you mentioned controversy with the teachers union in England, thoughts on how to build a broader base of support over time, not just in this room, for these reforms?
Okay, thanks, Jen. I think we're meant to finish at 12:15, so this better be the last question. But I'm around, so if anybody wants to ask any other questions, feel free to come and talk to me afterwards. But I want to keep you on schedule. I'm not sure that we got all that right in England, by the way. So I've got lots of thoughts about it, but they're not thoughts on the basis of success. Quite a lot of our education reforms were done in spite of teacher either overt opposition or kind of reluctance, what the army calls dumb insolence. I think when I look back on that education reform, we didn't invest enough time, attention, money actually in communicating with leaders through the system. We had an early phase where we just did it, and that was important because you've got momentum and you had a kind of moral authority from a newly elected prime minister, and then it got harder. But we should have invested more deeply earlier in the quality of communication with leaders. We tended to think we could do it all ourselves. We didn't build enough allies. Michael Fullan has a really nice phrase in some of his more recent work where he talks about building ever-widening circles of leadership. So the concept we developed in England based on John Cotter's work at Harvard was build a guiding coalition, the 7 or 10 people who are going to drive this at the centre. And then Michael's adaptation of that is to say, well, you take the 7 or 10 people and then you build the leadership circles outwards. And we did get onto that, but we got onto it too late. And the relationship between government and teaching professional, government and doctors for that matter, hasn't been as good as it could have been. I'm not naive though. I don't believe that quality of communication everybody would have said, oh yeah, this is a good idea, let's do it. So I'm not saying you just concede to them or that you water it down through those negotiations, because the rigor of the reform is what delivers the results. But I am saying we needed more people who understood what we were trying to do from the beginning. So we have 150 school districts. We could have got those 150 heads of the school districts, local authorities we call them, we could have had them in a room once every 3 months and explained to them what we were doing. We did get onto, as Vicky Phillips knows, we did get onto communicating with the head teachers, but it wasn't enough, it was too late. And it worked quite well, but it wasn't enough and it was too late. So you need to do more of that, not in the naive hope that everybody will agree with you, but in the hope that everybody will understand what you're trying to do. We had somebody come and see us after 2 years of the education reforms, and he said, 2 years ago we thought you were mad and it wouldn't work. Now we think it will work, but we still think you're mad. Now we could have persuaded people like him sooner that we weren't quite as mad as he thought we were. Thanks very much for your time.